The cargo container slammed against the docking clamp with a metallic screech that made Dan Reed wince. 3 months hauling freight between mining operations, and he still hated that sound. His hands moved across the control panel, adjusting the magnetic locks while his eyes tracked the readouts. Everything looked normal. The asteroid, designated AR 7744, floated in the viewport, its surface scarred by drilling operations that never stopped. Dan activated his suit radio. Freight vessel Delta 9 to mining station, container secured. Beginning transfer protocol. Static crackled before the response came. Copy that, Delta 9. You're clear to proceed. He pushed away from the controls and floated toward the airlock. Working in zero gravity had become second nature after years in space construction. His body knew how to move, how to compensate, how to use momentum instead of fighting it. The suit felt bulky around him, but that was standard safety protocol. Nobody worked outside without proper protection. The airlock cycled open, and Dan guided himself along the tether line toward the container. His gloved hands checked the seals one by one. Routine work. Boring work. The kind that paid enough to keep his ship running and left him alone with his thoughts. That was when the first shot hit the container next to his head. Dan jerked sideways, his training kicking in before his mind caught up. The tether line went taut as he swung behind the container for cover. His heart hammered, but his breathing stayed controlled. Panic killed people in space faster than bullets. Three ships materialized from behind the asteroid, their hulls painted in the red and black patterns of crawl raiders. Dan cursed under his breath. Everyone knew about the crawl. Insectoid species, built like armored tanks, and they made their living selling slaves to whoever paid best. Another shot sparked off the container. Dan's suit radio exploded with warnings, and the mining station screaming for him to get back inside. But the raiders were already moving to cut off his escape route. Their boarding craft launched, closing the distance faster than he could retreat. His hand moved to the emergency release on his tool belt. Not much a weapon, but it was something. The magnetic wrench could be thrown hard enough to crack a viewport if he aimed right. The boarding craft slammed into the container with enough force to tear it free from the docking clamp. Dan lost his grip on the tether. He tumbled through space, his suit jets firing automatically to stabilize him. Through the faceplate, he saw crawl warriors emerging from their craft, each one twice his size and covered in natural armor that looked like chitinous plates. One of them grabbed him mid-tumble. The suit's pressure sensors screamed warnings as the crawl's claws punctured the outer layer. Dan tried to fight back, but the thing was impossibly strong. His fist connected with its head and bounced off like hitting concrete. Two more crawl grabbed his arms. They dragged him toward their boarding craft while he kicked and struggled. The tool belt was torn away. His helmet cracked under a casual backhand that would have killed him if the inner layer had failed. Inside the boarding craft, they slammed him against a wall. Dan's vision blurred from the impact. Clawed hands ripped at his suit, tearing away pieces until he was left in just the underlayer garment. The cold hit him immediately, but not as hard as the realization that he was trapped at a crawl that looked bigger than the others stepped forward. Its mandibles clicked together in a way that almost sounded like speech. Then a translator device on its chest converted the sounds to words. Human, you're a property now. Resist and die. Obey and live to serve. Dan said nothing. His eyes tracked the room instead. 6 crawl warriors. 1 exit behind them. His suit and tools in a heap near the airlock. The ship was already moving. He could feel the engines vibrating through the wall. The big crawl grabbed Dan's face, forcing him to look up. I'm Brutus. I command this vessel. Your species is weak. You need your machines and your weapons to survive. Without them, you are nothing. Another crawl, slightly smaller with different markings, moved closer. Captain, we should secure him with the others. Brutus released Dan's face. Yes, Sala. Put him in maximum restraints. I want the galaxy to see what happens to humans who think themselves important. They dragged Dan through the ship's corridors. He saw other prisoners in cells along the way. A trail mechanic with 6 arms curled against the wall. A Vorsh trader with its eye stalks drooping in defeat. Others he did not recognize, all of them looking broken and hopeless. The cell they threw him into was bare metal. Chains hung from the ceiling, each link as thick as his thumb. The crawl locked heavy restraints around Dan's wrists and ankles, then connected them to the chains. When they finished, he was suspended with his arms spread and his feet barely touching the floor. Brutus stood in the doorway. Your people build armor because you were born weak. Your ships have weapons because you cannot fight with your bodies. You're soft creatures playing at being strong. Dan tested the chains. They did not move at all. The restraints cut into his wrists, designed to hold something much larger and stronger than a human. His shoulders already ached from the position. Sala lingered after Brutus left. She stared at Dan with compound eyes that reflected no emotion he could read. Why do you not beg? Most species beg by now. Dan met her gaze. Would it change anything? No. Then I will save my breath. Sala's mandibles clicked softly. Your heart rate has not increased since capture. Your species shows fear differently, or you are too stupid to understand danger. Maybe I understand it better than you think. She left without responding. The cell door sealed with a hiss of hydraulics. Dan hung in the chains, alone in the darkness. His body hurt, and his situation looked impossible. But his mind was already working. He had grown up in Earth's Arctic regions where equipment failure meant death. He had worked construction in space where one mistake ended everything. He knew how to stay calm when everything went wrong. The chains were strong, but chains had weak points. The restraints were solid, but they had to connect somewhere. The crawl thought humans were weak without their gear. That was their mistake. Dan had spent his whole life learning that the best tool a human had was the refusal to quit. He closed his eyes and started counting his breaths. Slow and steady. His grandfather had taught him that. Control your breathing, control your panic, control the situation. The chains would not break easily, but nothing stayed unbreakable forever. Not when a human decided otherwise. That I in the darkness. Dan began to plan. 18 hours passed in the cell. Dan counted time by the guard rotations. Every 6 hours, new crawl warriors walked past his door. Their footsteps made distinct patterns on the metal floor. Heavy, confident, careless. His shoulders screamed at him, but he had learned long ago how to push pain into a corner of his mind. Arctic construction crews worked through worse. Broken fingers, frostbite, injuries that would have sent softer workers home. You finished the job or you did not eat. Simple as that. Through the small window in his door, Dan watched other prisoners. The trail mechanic had not moved from his corner. The Vorsh trader kept making sounds that might have been crying. Across the corridor, a Centaurian navigator pressed against her cell wall. Her large eyes filled with hopelessness. Footsteps approached. Different from the guards. Heavier. The door opened and Brutus filled the frame. Behind him stood 2 warriors holding shock prods. Still alive, human? I thought your kind needed constant comfort to survive. Brutus stepped closer. In 3 days we reach the slave markets of Keller Station. You'll be sold to whoever values soft labor. Perhaps as a pet. Your species has aesthetic value to some buyers. Dan said nothing. His eyes tracked the shock prods instead. Electric weapons. Designed to incapacitate without killing. That meant they were afraid of damaging valuable merchandise. Brutus grabbed Dan's chin. Speak when addressed. Animal. You want me to talk or stay quiet? Make up your mind. The backhand snapped Dan's head sideways. Blood filled his mouth, but he had taken worse hits in bar fights. He turned back to face Brutus and smiled with red teeth. Your species builds weapons because you are prey pretending to be predators. Brutus released him. Prey always dies. After they left, the Centaurian called out from her cell. Her voice sounded like wind chimes. Why anger them? They will hurt you more. Dan spit blood onto the floor. Because angry people make mistakes. You cannot escape. The chains are unbreakable. Designed to hold Krogath warriors who can lift 3 tons. Designed for what they expected. Dan tested the chains again. The mounting bracket on the ceiling was solid, but it connected to the ship's frame. Everything connected to something. They didn't design it for what I can do. The trail mechanic spoke for the first time. What can you do? You are small. Weak. Humans have no natural weapons. No armor. No strength worth mentioning. Dan closed his eyes and thought about his grandfather. Old man had worked oil rigs in the North Sea. Survived 3 platform collapses. Lost 2 fingers and kept working. He used to say that human strength was not about lifting heavy things. It was about refusing to stay down. Let me tell you about Earth. Dan's voice carried to the other cells. My planet tried to kill us for millions of years. Ice ages, diseases, predators with claws and teeth. We had nothing but our brains and our stubbornness. So we learned. We adapted. We survived everything that should have killed us. The Vorse trader's eye stalks turned toward his cell. That does not help you now, doesn't it? Dan shifted his weight, testing the chains from a different angle. I grew up in a place where the temperature dropped low enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Equipment failed all the time. Heaters broke. Zuit's Tula. You learned to keep going or you died. Simple. He pulled against the chains with steady pressure. Not explosive force, just constant tension. The mounting bracket groaned softly. The other prisoners noticed. The Krall are not wrong about humans needing technology. The Centaurian sounded confused. Your species dies in space without life support. Decent extreme temperatures. Dies easily compared to most spacefaring races. Den Lauget. It hurt his split lip. We die easy? Lady, humans crossed oceans in wooden boats before we had engines. We climbed mountains that killed most who tried. We went to our own moon using computers less powerful than child's toy. We die easy because we put ourselves in situations that should be impossible to survive. Then we survive anyway. The chains groaned again. Softer this time, but present. Dan adjusted his grip and pulled at a different angle. His shoulders felt like they were tearing apart, but he had dislocated his left shoulder twice in construction accidents. He knew what that felt like, and this was not there yet. You are insane. The trail mechanic watched through his cell window. Even if you break free, there are 30 Krall on this ship. You have no weapons, no armor, no chance. My grandfather used to tell me about improvised weapons. Anything can be a weapon if you use it right. These chains? Already thinking about it. Hours crawled past. Dan worked the chains in small movements whenever guards were not watching. Pull, release, shift weight, pull again from different angle. The mounting bracket had a weak point where 2 welds met. Shipbuilders always rushed welds in non-critical areas. He had seen it 1,000 times in construction. The next guard rotation brought someone new. Sala. She stopped at his cell and stared at him for a long moment. Your heart rate is elevated now. Finally showing fear. Exercise. Dan pulled against the chains again. Humans need to keep moving or our muscles atrophy. We evolved as endurance hunters. Chase prey until it collapses from exhaustion. Can't do that if I let myself get weak. Sala's mandibles clicked. You are strange creatures. Most prisoners spend their time in despair. You spend it telling stories and pulling on unbreakable restraints. They're only unbreakable if I believe they are. She moved closer to the cell window. What makes your species so convinced of your own capability? You are objectively weaker than Krall. Weaker than most species. Your natural weapons are pathetic. Yet you speak as if you have already won. Dan met her compound eyes. Because giving up is not in our nature. Humans are stubborn. We try things that should not work. Sometimes they don't. But sometimes they do, and that's enough. Sala left without responding. But Dan noticed she did not report his behavior to Brutus. The following shift, Dan felt the mounting bracket shift. Just slightly. Just enough. The weld had a microscopic crack now. Physics and persistence working together. One more good pull, and it would tear free. But timing mattered. He needed the guards to be far enough away that he could act before they responded. He whispered to the trail mechanic. Tomorrow, during feeding, stay away from my cell door. You are truly attempting escape. I'm truly refusing to be property. The Centaurian's voice was barely audible. If you manage this impossible thing, will you help us? Dan tested the chains one more time. The bracket groaned louder now. Help anyone who wants to try. But you have to be ready to move. No hosetashchen. The Vorse trader made a sound like grinding rocks. I will be ready. Dan closed his eyes and regulated his breathing. Tomorrow, 27 hours until they reached Keller Station. 27 hours until he became merchandise. Not much time, but humans had overcome worse odds with less preparation. His grandfather's words echoed in his memory. The best tool you have is between your ears. The second best is your refusal to accept defeat. Everything else is just details. Dan smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow the crawl would learn something about humans that their intelligence reports had missed. They would learn that taking away the gear did not take away what made humans dangerous. It just made them creative. Feeding time came with the smell of something that reminded Dan of burnt plastic. The crawl brought nutritional packs designed to keep prisoners alive without being pleasant. Two guards walked the corridor, sliding packs through the cell door slots. They talked to each other in their clicking language, relaxed and casual. Dan positioned himself carefully. His muscles were oxygenated, his mind clear. The mounting bracket had a crack now, invisible to casual inspection, but there. He had worked with enough structural failures to know exactly how much force it would take. The guards reached his cell. One slid the nutritional pack through the slot, while the other watched with obvious boredom. Standard procedure. They had done this hundreds of times with thousands of prisoners. Nothing ever happened during feeding. Dan took 3 deep breaths. In through the nose, out through the mouth. His heart rate slowed. His vision sharpened. Every combat instructor he had ever trained with said the same thing. Control your body before you control the fight. That he pulled against the chains with everything he had. Not just arm strength, but legs pushing against the floor, core muscles engaged, shoulders rotating to create angular force against the bracket. The weld screamed. Metal fatigue won over structural integrity. The mounting bracket tore free from the ceiling. Dan dropped to the floor with chains still attached to his wrists. The guard spun toward the noise, but he was already moving. The chain in his right hand whipped forward, the heavy restraint at the end becoming a makeshift flail. It caught the first guard across the faceplate of his helmet. Chitin cracked. The second guard raised a shock prod, but Dan ducked under the swing. Close quarters worked in his favor. The crawl were built for power, not tight spaces. Dan wrapped the chain around the prod and yanked. The guard stumbled forward, and Dan's knee came up into the soft joint where the neck met the torso. Not enough to seriously hurt through the armor, but enough to stagger. More guards came running. The alarm started screaming throughout the ship. Dan grabbed the shock prod from the fallen guard and jammed it into the door controls of his cell. Sparks flew, and the door slid open. The Trell mechanic pressed against his cell wall. "What are you doing?" "Leaving." "You coming?" Dan hit the door controls for the other cells with the prod. The overload fried the locking mechanisms. Doors slid open along the corridor point. 4 more crawl guards rounded the corner in formation. Dan threw the shock prod at the lead guard and dove for the fallen guard's equipment belt. Crawl carried plasma cutters for emergency hull repairs. He grabbed one and activated it. Blue flame erupted from the nozzle. The guards charged. Dan waited until the last second, then swept the plasma cutter across their path at knee height. The flame did not penetrate their armor, but it heated the metal enough to make them instinctively pull back. Human reaction time was faster. He used their hesitation to slide past them down the corridor. The Centaurian navigator and Vorsh trader stumbled out of their cells. The Trell mechanic finally moved, all 6 arms reaching for anything that could be a weapon. Other prisoners emerged, confused and frightened, but seeing an opportunity. Maintenance tunnels. Dan pointed at an access panel. Too small for Crawl to follow easily. "Move now." A massive crawl burst through the far door. Brutus. The captain's armor was heavier than the others, decorated with kill markings. He carried a plasma rifle that looked like it could punch through a ship's hull. Impossible. Humans cannot break those restraints. Dan still had chains hanging from his wrists. He swung them experimentally. Funny thing about impossible. Usually just means nobody tried hard enough. Brutus fired. Dan was already moving, using the corridor's support struts for cover. The plasma bolt melted a hole in the wall where he had been standing. Superheated air washed over him, but he ignored it. Arctic training taught you to ignore environmental discomfort. The freed prisoners scattered. Some ran for the maintenance tunnels. Others tried to hide. The Trell mechanic grabbed a piece of broken door and used it as a shield. The Vorsh trader's multiple limbs let him climb the walls, moving along the ceiling where guards could not easily reach. More crawl poured into the corridor. Dan counted 8. No, 10. Too many to fight directly. He threw the plasma cutter at the nearest one. It bounced off armor, but distracted them for a second. That second was enough to reach the maintenance panel the Centaurian had opened. Brutus fired again. The bolt caught Dan's shoulder as he dove through the opening. Pain exploded through his arm, but adrenaline kept him moving. The maintenance tunnel was tight, barely wide enough for a human. Perfect. Behind him, Krall tried to follow, but their bulk wedged in the opening. Dan crawled deeper into the tunnel network. His shoulder screamed at him. He could smell burnt flesh. His own. That would need treatment eventually, but not now. The Centaurian navigator crawled beside him. You are injured. I'm functional. Keep moving. The tunnels branched in multiple directions. Dan chose paths that angled downward. Ships always put critical systems in the center for protection. He needed to reach the engineering level where the escape pods would be located. Sounds of pursuit echoed through the tunnels. The Krall were tearing access panels away, trying to intercept them. Dan led the group through turns and junctions, relying on his cargo hauler experience. All ships had similar layouts. Life support here, power conduits there, gravity generators below. They reached a vertical shaft. Dan looked down, 20 meters at least. Emergency ladders ran along the walls, but they were designed for Krall dimensions. Each rung was spaced too far apart for comfortable human climbing. The trail mechanic peered over the edge. We cannot climb that. Then we improvise. Dan wrapped the chains still attached to his wrists around the ladder support rail. Slide down. Use the chains to control speed. He went first, showing them how. The chain bit into his palms, but it was better than falling. Halfway down, his injured shoulder gave out. He dropped the last 10 meters and hit the deck hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. The others followed more carefully. The Vorse trader used his multiple limbs to actually climb down properly. The Centaurian had natural climbing abilities Dan had not known about. They reached the bottom while Dan caught his breath and checked his shoulder, bad burn, blistered and weeping. But the joint still worked, and that was what mattered. He tore a piece of fabric from his undergarment and wrapped it loosely over the wound. Not sterile, but better than nothing. They were in an engineering corridor now. Pipes and conduits ran along the walls. The hum of the ship's engines vibrated through everything. Dan oriented himself using the sound. Engines forward meant escape pods aft. A door ahead slid open. Sala stepped through, holding a plasma pistol. She aimed it at Dan's chest. For a moment, nobody moved. Dan's hand tightened on the chain. Too far to reach her before she fired. The other prisoners tensed, ready to run or fight. Sala's mandibles clicked rapidly. Her weapon did not waver, but her voice sounded different. How did you break free? Those restraints should have held. The engineering reports said they could restrain a Krogath berserker. Engineering reports don't account for stubbornness. Dan kept his eyes on her weapon. You going to shoot, or can we skip to the part where you decide what matters more? What do you mean? Honor or orders? Strength or obedience? Your culture respects power, right? I just demonstrated power, not with weapons or technology, with determination. That has to count for something in Krall philosophy. Sala's weapon lowered slightly. You should not have been able to do this. Your species is weak. My species survived everything our planet threw at us. We didn't get soft. We got smart. Dan took a careful step forward. You can shoot me. Probably should if you want to keep your position. But I don't think you're going to. Behind Sala, more Krall appeared. The corridor filled with warriors, Brutus at their head. His mandibles were spread in what might have been anger. Sala, execute the human. Now, Dan prepared to move. Maybe he could grab her weapon before she fired. Maybe the others could escape while he provided a distraction. Maybe a lot of things. Sala turned and shot Brutus. The plasma bolt caught Brutus in the shoulder. His armor absorbed most of the impact, but the force knocked him backward into the warriors behind him. Chaos erupted in the corridor. Some Krall raised weapons at Sala. Others tried to grab Brutus to check his injuries. The formation collapsed into confusion. Sala grabbed Dan's arm and pulled him through a side door. The other prisoners followed as she sealed it behind them. Emergency locks engaged with heavy metallic thuds. Why'd you do that? Dan's shoulder throbbed. but his mind was clear. You just betrayed your entire crew. Sala's mandibles clicked rapidly. Brutus was wrong. The philosophy of strength through natural ability is sacred to Crawl. You demonstrated strength. He refused to acknowledge it. That makes him weak, not you. Pounding started on the door. Voices shouted in the Crawl language. Sala checked her weapon's charge indicator. We have perhaps 5 minutes before they breach this door. The escape pod bay is 3 levels down. I know a route through the maintenance sections. The trail mechanic stared at her. You are helping us? Why? Because your human proved something I suspected. Species that rely on technology are not weak. They are adaptive. Adaptation is the highest form of strength. Sala moved to another access panel. My people's philosophy has become rigid. We mock others for using tools while we use ships and weapons ourselves. The contradiction was obvious, but Brutus refused to see it. Dan followed her into another tunnel system. This one was wider, designed for moving equipment. His shoulder felt like someone was pressing a hot iron against it, but he pushed the pain aside. Arctic workers learned early that acknowledging pain did not make it stop, just made you focus on it. Your species uses weapons too. Dan kept pace with Sala despite his injury. How is that different from humans using gear? That is exactly the question Brutus would not answer. Sala navigated turns without hesitation. We tell ourselves our weapons are extensions of natural strength. But a weapon is a tool. A ship is a tool. We are hypocrites who convinced ourselves otherwise. They descended through access shafts and crossed through what looked like a water recycling station. The Centaurian navigator struggled with the pace. Her species was built for low-gravity environments. The Vorse trader moved well, but kept making worried sounds. Only the trail mechanic seemed unaffected, his 6 arms giving him stability on the uneven terrain. Tell me about Earth. Sala glanced back at Dan. How did your species survive to reach space? Your planet is classified as a death world. Extreme temperature variations, dangerous weather, predators, disease. By all logic, you should have evolved into something much more physically capable. Dan thought about his grandfather's stories. We did evolve, just not the way you're thinking. Our brains got bigger. Our hands got better at making things. Our bodies stayed flexible instead of specialized. A bear is stronger than a human. A cheetah is faster. A crocodile has better armor. But none of them can do all the things we can. You threw projectiles. Sala opened another door. During the fight, you threw objects with precision. Most species cannot do that. The biomechanics require specific shoulder and wrist evolution. Humans are the best throwers in the known galaxy. Dan allowed himself a small smile despite the pain. We can calculate trajectory instinctively. Our ancestors hunted by throwing rocks and spears. That skill is built into our nervous system. They reached a large chamber filled with machinery. Graffiti generators den realized. The hum was different here, deeper and more rhythmic. Sala led them around the massive equipment toward another exit. The door ahead opened before they reached it. 3 Crawl warriors blocked their path. These ones wore different armor, more decorative. Officers or specialists of some kind. The lead warrior's mandibles spread wide. Sala, Brutus has declared you traitor. Surrender, and your death will be honorable. Sala raised her weapon. I follow true strength, not Brutus's pride. Dan stepped forward, chains still hanging from his wrists. His body ached, and his shoulder was definitely getting worse, but tactical thinking did not require physical perfection. You 3 look smart enough to understand mathematics. Count your odds. We have 6 beings willing to fight. You have 3. Sala knows your tactics. I fight unpredictably because my species learned creativity is survival. Walk away and nobody else gets hurt. The lead warrior laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. Human, you're injured and unarmed. We are trained warriors in full combat gear. Your mathematics are flawed. Are they? Dan's voice stayed calm. Your armor protects against weapons, not against chains used as leverage points, not against targeting joints and weak points, not against someone willing to take damage to create openings. I already fought through 8 of your crew to get here. How many more want to try? The warriors hesitated. Dan recognized that pause. They were reassessing. Smart fighters always did. He pressed the advantage. Your culture respects strength. I respect that. But strength comes in different forms. You're strong in direct combat. I'm strong in refusing to quit. Both are valid. Both are dangerous. Question is whether you want to test which one wins today. Behind him, the trail mechanic grabbed a piece of pipe from the machinery. The Vorsh trader positioned himself to use his climbing ability as an advantage. Even the Centaurian navigator picked up a tool from a maintenance station. They looked ready to fight despite their fear. The lead warrior's mandibles clicked slowly. The human speaks truth. Brutus has always been too rigid in his thinking. He lowered his weapon slightly. We will report that you went toward the cargo bay. That gives you perhaps 10 minutes. Sala's surprise was obvious. Why would you do this? Because watching a human break restraints that should be impossible made me question other impossibilities. The warrior stepped aside. Go. If we meet again under Brutus's orders, this mercy ends. They moved quickly through the door. Dan heard it seal behind them. His legs felt shaky now. Adrenaline was wearing off, and the pain was getting harder to ignore. The burned shoulder had started bleeding again. The Centaurian noticed him favoring his left side. You need medical treatment. I need to get off this ship. Medical care comes after freedom. Dan forced himself to keep pace with the others. Sala led them through 2 more sections. They passed crew quarters and storage areas. Twice they heard search parties in adjacent corridors, but Sala's knowledge of the ship's layout kept them ahead of pursuit. Finally, they reached a sealed bulkhead with escape pod symbols. Sala worked the control panel. Beyond this door is the pod bay. 20 pods total. Once we launch, the ship will try to destroy us with point defense weapons. We need to launch simultaneously to overwhelm targeting systems. How do we coordinate that? The trail mechanic studied the door. We cannot communicate between pods. Dan leaned against the wall, conserving energy. Don't need to communicate. Human counting is universal. We all launch on a 3 count. 1, 2, 3, launch. Simple. What if pursuit reaches us before we can launch? The Vorsh trader's eye stalks swiveled nervously. Then we fight. Dan straightened up despite his body's protests. Same as we've been doing. Humans don't have a lot of natural advantages, but we're really good at one thing. We don't know when to give up. That's not stubbornness, that's strategy. Sala opened the bulkhead. The escape pod bay stretched before them. Pods lined up in their launch tubes like bullets in a chamber. Empty and waiting, then alarms started screaming. Red lights flashed throughout the bay. Brutus's voice echoed through the ship's intercom system. All pods locked. All launch systems disabled. Traitors, you have nowhere left to run. Dan looked at the pods, then at Sala. Can you override it? Not from here. The controls are in the command center. Her mandibles drooped. We are trapped. No. Dan walked toward the nearest pod, despite his exhaustion. We're just back to the start, facing something that looks impossible. I've been there before. Brutus entered the pod bay with 20 warriors behind him. They spread out in formation, blocking all exits. The captain's armor had been repaired, but Dan could see scoring where Sala's shot had hit. Brutus carried his plasma rifle, and his mandibles were spread in pure rage. Human, you have caused more damage than any prisoner in Crawl history. For that, I almost respect you. Brutus stepped forward. Almost. But respect requires acknowledgement that you are a warrior. You are not. You are cargo that broke its restraints. Dan stood his ground despite his exhaustion. Keep telling yourself that. I will prove it to everyone watching. Brutus gestured and his warriors activated recording devices. The galaxy will see what happens when humans fight without their machines. They will see you broken. They will see your species for what it truly is. Sala moved beside Dan. Captain, this is dishonorable. He is injured and unarmed. Then it should be quick. Brutus removed his armor piece by piece, dropping it to the deck with heavy thuds. I will face him as nature made us both. No weapons. No enhancements. Pure strength against weakness. Dan understood the strategy immediately. This was not just about killing him. It was about breaking the idea of human capability. Brutus would beat him to death on camera and use it as propaganda. Smart and brutal. If I win, everyone goes free. Dan's voice was steady despite knowing the odds. You will not win. But yes, I agree to your terms. When you lose, all witnesses live to tell what they saw. Brutus handed his rifle to a warrior. They will tell the galaxy that humans are nothing special. The trail mechanic whispered urgently. Do not do this. He will kill you. Dan walked toward the center of the bay. Probably. But if there's a chance everyone else gets away, I have to try. That's what humans do. We try impossible things. Movement caught his eye. The gravity indicators on the wall were flickering. Someone had damaged the generators during the fighting. The gravity in this section was failing. Dan felt it immediately. That strange lightness before zero-G kicked in fully. Brutus charged before the gravity completely failed. His first punch would have caved in Dan's chest, but the reduced gravity threw off his timing. Dan pushed off the deck and floated upward, the punch passing beneath him, 0 gravity. Dan had worked in it for years. His body knew how to move without ground beneath his feet. Brutus was floundering, grabbing for handholds to stabilize himself. Dan grabbed a ceiling support beam and pulled himself into a controlled spin. His legs caught Brutus across the head as he tumbled past. The impact sent both of them spinning, but Dan recovered faster, using the wall to redirect his momentum. You should have kept your armor on. Dan's voice was strained but confident. Humans train in zero-G. We're not built for it, but we adapt. Same as everything else. Brutus roared and pushed off hard from the wall. Too hard. He shot across the bay and crashed into equipment on the far side. Dan used the pause to grab one of the chains still attached to his wrist. In zero-G, even a chain became a precision tool. The crawl captain recovered and launched himself again. Dan whipped the chain in a wide arc. The heavy restraint at the end caught Brutus in the leg joint. Not enough to seriously injure through his natural armor, but enough to spin him off course. He tumbled past, and Dan kicked off after him. They collided in the center of the bay. Brutus's claws scraped across Dan's ribs. Pain exploded, but Dan wrapped the chain around the crawl's arm and used it as leverage. In zero-G, strength mattered less than momentum and positioning. Dan pulled Brutus into a spin, then released him at the right moment. The captain shot toward a wall of sharp equipment. Brutus tried to twist away, but his species was not built for three-dimensional combat. He hit hard and rebounded in an uncontrolled tumble that Dan's grandfather used to say that humans were persistence hunters. They chased prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. Brutus was stronger, but Dan could keep going. His shoulder was screaming and his ribs felt broken, but pain was just information. He could function through it. The captain steadied himself and charged again. Dan went low, or what counted as low in zero-G, and grabbed Brutus's legs as he passed. Using the momentum, Dan swung himself around and slammed both feet into the crawl's back. They separated, both tumbling. You cannot win. Brutus grabbed a support strut to stop his spin. I'm twice your mass. 3 times your strength. Yeah. Dan caught himself on a pod housing. But you're running out of breath, and I'm not. It was true. Brutus's breathing had become labored. Crawl were built for short, explosive combat. Their muscles were powerful, but burned energy quickly. Dan's human endurance, evolved from chasing prey across African plains, let him keep fighting when others would have collapsed. They fought for another 5 minutes. Dan took more hits than he gave, but each exchange exhausted Brutus a little more. The captain's movements became slower, less precise. Dan stayed controlled even as his body accumulated damage. Finally, Dan saw his opening. Brutus overextended on a lunge. Dan caught the arm, wrapped both chains around it, and used the support structure to create a joint lock. In normal gravity, it would not have worked. In zero-G, leverage was everything. Brutus struggled, but the position had him trapped. The more he pulled, the tighter the chains became. Dan's body was failing, but he just needed to hold on a little longer. Yield. Dan's voice was barely a whisper. I can dislocate your shoulder from here. You'll survive, but you'll be injured. Or you can honor your word. For a long moment, the only sound was their breathing. Then Brutus's mandibles clicked slowly. I yield. The human has won. Dan released him and pushed away. His vision was blurring. The injuries were catching up. He floated in the zero-G, trying to stay conscious. Sala moved to his side, using maneuvering thrusters from her equipment belt. "You actually did it." Brutus steadied himself and faced his warriors. "I gave my word. Release the podlocks. All prisoners are free to leave." One warrior protested. "Captain, our honor. Our honor is maintained by keeping our word." Brutus turned to Dan. "I do not understand your species, but I was wrong about you. Tell the galaxy that Krall acknowledge human strength." The podlocks disengaged with a series of clicks. Sala guided Dan toward the nearest pod, while the other prisoners rushed to their own. The trail mechanic gave Dan a gesture of respect. The Vorsh trader's eye stalks focused on him with what might have been admiration. Dan collapsed into the pod's acceleration seat. Sala sealed the door and initiated launch sequence. Through the viewport, he saw other pods launching simultaneously, just like he planned. Simple counting. Human universal language. The pod's engines fired, and they shot away from the Krall ship. Dan watched it recede through the viewport. Brutus's warriors were not firing the defense weapons. Honor kept them still. Sala worked the navigation console. "We are on course for the nearest trading station. Estimated arrival in 3 days. Medical supplies on board." Dan's voice was weak. "Yes. Basic emergency kit. Your injuries need proper treatment, but we can stabilize you." Sala turned to look at him. "Why did you fight him? You could have tried to negotiate." Dan closed his eyes. "Because humans learned a long time ago that sometimes you have to show people what you're capable of. Words are cheap. Actions matter." He paused, breathing carefully around his damaged ribs. "Besides, he was wrong about us. Someone needed to prove it." The pod's automated systems began broadcasting distress signals. Other ships in the sector would hear them soon. Rescue was coming. Dan let himself relax, slightly despite the pain. "Your species will change the galaxy's perception now." Sala monitored their trajectory. "This recording will spread. Everyone will see what humans can do." Good. Dan's consciousness was fading, but he fought to stay awake a little longer. Maybe next time someone captures a human, they'll think twice. The star streamed past the viewport. Free. Injured but free. Dan finally let unconsciousness take him. 3 days in the escape pod felt like 3 weeks. Dan drifted in and out of consciousness while Sally used the medical supplies to keep him alive. The burns on his shoulder had been treated with synthetic skin. His ribs were wrapped tight. Pain medication kept the worst at bay, but he still felt every injury. When he was awake, the other prisoners asked him questions. The trail mechanic wanted to understand human pain tolerance. The Vorsh trader was curious about Earth's history. The Centaurian navigator just seemed grateful to be alive. Dan told him stories between bouts of sleep. He described his grandfather's tales of survival in the Arctic. Oil rig disasters where crews kept working through injuries that should have been fatal. Construction accidents where workers jury-rigged solutions that saved lives. His time in the military where instructors taught that surrendering was never the first option. "Your planet sounds terrible." The trail mechanic listened with all 6 arms folded. "Why do humans stay there?" "Because it's home." Dan shifted carefully in his seat. "Also because we're stubborn. Earth tried to kill us for millions of years, and we're still there. That's not stupidity, that's determination." The Centaurian navigator worked the communication console. "I'm detecting multiple ships approaching. They are responding to our distress signal." Sala checked the scanner. "Trading vessels and a patrol ship. No hostile signatures. We are safe." Within an hour, they were docked with a massive trading station called Outpost 229. Medical teams were waiting. Dan was loaded onto a stretcher despite his protests that he could walk. The medical staff were a mix of species, all of them staring at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to disbelief. A Centaurian doctor examined his injuries. "You fought in this condition? Your species has remarkable pain tolerance." "Not remarkable, just necessary." Dan winced as the doctor prodded his ribs. "Humans evolved to keep moving even when injured. Predators don't give you time to heal." Word spread fast through the station. The recording Brutus had made was already circulating on communication networks. Dan watched part of it on a medical display. Seeing himself fight in zero gravity made the experience seem less real somehow. Like watching someone else, but the reaction was real. Messages flooded in from across the sector. Some species were frightened by the display of human capability. Others were impressed. A few requested information about hiring human security personnel. The station commander requested a meeting. Dan went despite the doctor's objections. His ribs were healing thanks to advanced medical technology, but movement still hurt. Sala accompanied him, along with the other freed prisoners. The commander was Hallex, a tall Centaurian with elaborate head markings that indicated high diplomatic status. His office overlooked the station's main trading floor where hundreds of beings conducted business. "Mr. Reed, your actions have created quite a situation." Hallex gestured for them to sit. "The Galactic Council is demanding an explanation. Krall representatives claim you somehow cheated during your escape." Dan lowered himself carefully into a chair. "Cheated how? I broke chains, fought guards, and survived. Everything I did was with the body I was born with." That is precisely their complaint. Hallex accessed a holographic display. "The Krall philosophy states that technology-dependent species are inferior. Your victory challenges their entire cultural identity. They are claiming the restraints were sabotaged or that you used hidden enhancements." Sala's mandibles clicked sharply. "The restraints were tested and certified. The recording shows everything." Brutus himself acknowledged defeat honorably. "I am aware." Halex's expression was difficult to read. "But politics complicates truth. The council needs to address this officially. They are requesting your presence." Dan looked at his hands. The chains had left marks on his wrists that would probably scar. "What does the council want?" "An apology for not dying quietly. They want to understand humans better." Hallex closed the hologram. "Your species has been part of the galactic community for 20 years, but you have remained relatively minor players. This incident suggests we have seriously underestimated human capability." Over the next week, Dan gave testimony to various council representatives. He explained human evolution, survival history, and the philosophy that Earth's hostility had forged. He demonstrated human flexibility, endurance, and throwing accuracy. Some representatives seemed convinced. Others remained skeptical. The trail mechanic started a business teaching non-human species about improvised weapons and human combat philosophy. The Vorse trader wrote a book about his experience. The Centaurian navigator requested assignment to human diplomatic missions. Sala faced trial for betraying Brutus, but Dan testified on her behalf. He explained Krall honor culture and how she had acted according to its highest principles. The council granted her asylum, and she became a consultant on interspecies cultural understanding. Messages came from Earth. Dan's family had seen the recordings. His grandfather, now 90 years old, sent a simple message that made Dan laugh despite his healing ribs. "Told you the chains were the easy part. Good work." Human military recruiters contacted him about teaching their tactics to other species. Diplomatic Corps wanted him for cultural exchanges. Private security firms offered contracts that would have made him wealthy. Dan declined everything. He just wanted to go back to hauling cargo. Simple work, quiet work, the kind where nobody tried to kill him. But the galaxy had changed its mind about humans. Trading vessels that carried human crew suddenly found themselves with better docking priorities. Negotiations that previously dismissed human input now sought it actively. Pirates who once targeted human ships began avoiding them entirely. Dan heard stories about other humans in tough situations. A human mechanic who fixed a ship's failing reactor with nothing but basic tools. A human medic who kept working through injuries that would have incapacitated most species. A human negotiator who outlasted everyone else in marathon peace talks. The stories always ended the same way. The humans succeeded because they refused to quit, because they adapted, because Earth had taught them that survival meant trying everything possible and then trying a few things that seemed impossible. 6 months after his escape, Dan was back on his cargo ship, running routine deliveries. He kept the broken chains mounted in his cockpit, not as a trophy, just as a reminder. Impossible was usually just the start of difficult. His communication console beeped. Incoming message from an unfamiliar ship. Dan activated the display. Brutus appeared, his mandibles clicking slowly. Human Dan Reed. I hope this message finds you well. Dan sat back in his pilot's seat. Captain, I'm surprised to hear from you. I wanted you to know that your actions have affected crawl philosophy. Many of us are reconsidering our views on technology and strength. Brutus shifted, looking uncomfortable. Some see this as weakness. Others see it as evolution of thought. There is much debate. Debate is healthy. Shows you're thinking instead of just following old patterns. Indeed, Brutus's mandibles spread slightly. I also wanted to inform you that the Crawl Council has issued a directive. Human vessels are to be treated with the respect due to warriors. You have earned this for your entire species. Dan touched the chains mounted above his console. I didn't do it for recognition. I just wanted to prove that humans are more than our gear. You succeeded. More than you know. Brutus paused. If we meet again, I hope it is as allies rather than enemies. I'd like that. The communication ended. Dan looked out at the stars, streaming past his viewport. Somewhere out there, other humans were probably facing their own impossible situations. He hoped they remembered what he had learned. Humans did not survive because they were the strongest or the fastest or the toughest. They survived because they refused to accept defeat. Because they looked at impossible situations and said, let's try anyway. Because Earth had spent millions of years trying to kill them, and they were still here, still adapting, still moving forward. The cargo container attached to his ship was full of mining equipment headed for a frontier colony. Routine work. Exactly what he wanted. Dan engaged the autopilot and closed his eyes for a short rest. His console beeped again. Different message. This one was from a Galactic Council officially recognizing humans as a Tier 2 species, upgraded from Tier 4. The classification came with new trade rights, diplomatic status, and military cooperation opportunities. All because one human refused to stay chained. Dan smiled and filed the message away. Let the politicians handle the political stuff. He had cargo to deliver, ships to fly, a simple life doing simple work, but he kept the chains mounted where he could see them. Some lessons were worth remembering. Some victories mattered more than others. And sometimes the best weapon a human had was the refusal to give up. The stars stretched endlessly ahead. Dan Reed, cargo hauler, flew into them carrying the message that humans had finally managed to communicate to the galaxy. They were not weak. They were not helpless. They were not dependent on their technology to be dangerous. They were human. And that was enough.